सर अगर आपको याद हो तो हमने स्टारशिप का लॉन्च देखा था,
हाँ
जिसमें बूस्टर केज भी देखा था।
हाँ
हाँ।
अभी वापस से कुछ दिनों पहले स्पेसएक्स ने एक परीक्षण किया स्टारशिप 7 का,
अच्छा
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 अच्छा।
जिसके अंदर बूस्टर सक्सेसफुली केज किया गया,
हाँ
लेकिन जो शिप था
हाँ।
वो लॉस हो गया।
अरे यार ये
तो मैं चाहता हूँ आप इसे देखें और इस पर अपनी प्रतिक्रिया दें।
क्या है सब कि ये जो परेशान जो होता है उसका मतलब भी यही होता है। अब जैसे वो परेशान जब बन गया, लेकिन वो जो शिप वो लॉस हुआ है, अगर मान लो कि उसमें अगर लोग बैठे हुए होते ना, उसमें लॉस हो जाता तो जाने। तो इसीलिए वो जो लॉस हुआ है, पैसे का मतलब ये कि यही होता है कि इसको चेक किया जाए और इसकी जानकारी निकले, कोई दिक्कत तो नहीं, कोई पैसा तो नहीं। अगर पैसा नहीं है तो वो आपके दुकान में कुछ है तो आप अपने को सुधार कर लें।
सच बोलूं तो जो बूस्टर केज की जो टेक्नोलॉजी है, वो तो मुझे देखने में इतना ज्यादा मजा आ रहा था। ऐसा लग रहा था कि जैसे बच्चों के खिलौना है, अपने मुकाम से निकला और फिर वापस आके लग गया। तो मुझे तो इतना मजा आया था, अद्भुत भी लगा था और मजा बहुत आया था। तो इसी बात पर लगाई ये वीडियो, हम ये भी देखना चाहेंगे।
Hello, it's Scott Manley here. Today we had Starship Super Heavy Flight number 7, and as you probably heard, it ended rather spectacularly. By this point, you've probably already seen a lot of video from around the Caribbean, specifically the Turks and Caicos Islands, showing the debris that is re-entering. And if you've watched all that, and I'm sorry that you had to watch all that vertical video, but that's what the kids like these days, apparently. But initially, Flight 7, it went vertical in a good way. Taking off a lot faster than Blue Origin's flight, very quickly switched over to a beautiful onboard view. This is obviously from the Starship stage. And if you look over on the left, right on the left side of the screen, you can see one of the bumper plates that was added where they were going to just test the aerodynamics of this. And you can see that it's actually beginning to pull away. I think that's steel, right? I think that is a piece of flat steel that is getting pulled off. Now, it holds in place. They get through max Q. This is going supersonic. It's flopping around like a piece of tape, but I think it's stainless steel. You see, they were wanting to test what the catch hardware aerodynamics would be like. So they had some dummy versions of the hardware on the outside. They weren't structural. They were more or less attached to the skin. These included pegs that would essentially hook onto the equivalent of the tower catch hardware, booster catch hardware, sorry. And there were bumper plates underneath it so that when the arms came in and they hit the side of the booster, you weren't going to break open the tank. You didn't want to have a fuel leak on landing, right? The launch happened around 4:30. That meant the sun was getting rather low on the horizon in the west and casting a shadow out to sea. And you can see, actually here, the shadow of the plume being cast out into the Gulf of Mexico. This is a view from the booster, and you can see that we're like at 100,000 feet, and at the bottom of the booster, you can actually see radial like blue streaks. The engines are already expanding outwards. It looks pretty beautiful. But you can also see the tower catch hardware, which we use. If you remember, they caught the booster on Flight 5, they did not catch the booster on Flight 6. The plan on this flight was that they would catch the booster and they would get Starship into orbit, or suborbit, fly across Africa, deploy some dummy satellites via the PEZ dispenser, and then perform another soft landing so that they could transition to full orbital operation. You didn't want to have something as big as Starship flying in orbit if you couldn't reliably control it and specifically deorbit it.
बहुत जरूरी है कंट्रोल करना बाबू भाई.
We've just reached most engines cut out on the booster, down to 3 engines. Beautiful live view of the hot staging this time. And of course the booster starts to head home. If you catch out the corner of your eye on the bottom left, you can see one of the booster engines did not relight during this initial boost back. So this means it'll need to burn the engines a little longer. It'll use a little more propellant because it has less thrust available. It's trying to put itself back over the launch site. Meanwhile, Starship continues onwards and upwards, propelled by 3 Raptor engines, heading out eastwards over the Gulf of Mexico trying to pick up enough speed to
खाली भूषण
remain
लोड
in
कर दिया
orbit.
खाली बस
You know that magical process that
आप
physics
दीजिए
gives
ध्यान
us
से
that
सुनो
lets you
जो भूषण है
fall
नहीं वो
towards
तो
the Earth
लोड
and
का
somehow
अरे वो
miss
निकल गया
continuously. And of course, a big part of that is burning copious quantities of propellant, and that was what part of the redesign of Starship. Starship V2 has extended the propellant tanks a whole lot. The cargo area is a bit smaller, but it's not good having a big cargo area if you can't carry it into orbit. We are still operating with the old school booster, which means that the hot stage ring, the hot stage adapter, has to get ditched to reduce the mass. We get some amazing views of that happening. Anyway, skipping forward a couple of minutes, booster is now more or less coming straight down, and this is one of my favorite sequences of this flight. So you can see those clouds down below it that it's going to fall through. Those are great because
हर
we
किसी
get
के
to
लिए
see
ये
how
अद्भुत
fast
नजारा ही
it's
है वो
actually
भाई
going. It was up at 100,000 feet, now it's down to like 60,000 feet. Those clouds, those are pretty high, right? That is the exhaust plume from the booster. That it has made its own clouds that we are looking through, and you can see the shadow that it's casting, the sort of crepuscular. I don't know. It's
बादलों को चीरते हुए तैयार है अपने मुकाम पे आने के
really
लिए
cool watching this happen. And then, of course, coming down, we get the various shock waves forming the plumes. We have that
अभी तो जलेगा वो भाई
area of super hot air that makes the engine bay glow red. And then all the engines that were supposed to light again. Remember, one had shut down and hadn't operated? Well, they all operate this time. It transitions back to 3 and then performs its very delicate swoop inwards to fit between the chopsticks.
आ गया शानदार अद्भुत
On the
बहुत
tower.
बढ़िया
And the crowd went absolutely wild. We were super excited. Yay, successful booster catch. That also was a moment of victory that had eluded us in the previous flight. It was once again there for everyone to see. And there wasn't nearly as much fire this time, although I gather there was a little bit later.
अब कितनी बड़ी चीज है वो लेकिन बड़े कंट्रोल रिमोट करना वाकई में बहुत दिमाग का काम है बहुत दिमाग का काम
the camera that
बहुत ही
is
ज्यादा
on the arm, you can see the whole thing is rocking very gently like a ginormous pendulum the size of an office block. For a glorious moment, all of our attention had been fixated upon the booster and its catch, and we hadn't been watching Starship. And when some of us did look back to Starship, we wondered why. What if the engines had failed? That wasn't good. And now, we didn't notice this at the time, but if you look very carefully at the hinge on that flap, you might catch the nearest hint of flames in there. Again, we didn't notice at the time. We were all looking at the booster. We get more engine failures very quickly in sequence. Now remember, on Starship, there are two types of engines. There's the large vacuum engines that are very efficient, and then there's a small traditional Raptors, which are sea-level versions. Those are the ones that can gimbal and they can steer. You need at least one of those steering engines to be able to operate. If you lose, if you're only down to vacuum engines, guess what? You're not able to steer anymore. And the telemetry stops at this moment. 146 kilometers up, 21,317 kilometers per hour. It is somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico when this happens, and we don't know what happens. Also notice on the propellant charts, the liquid oxygen is a lot higher than the methane level. That would suggest that something has been leaking. Now, if you replay this sequence at 4 times speed, you can visibly see the methane starting to leak a lot more quickly, and you can see the Starship in the telemetry start to pitch down as engines are lost. I expect you could also see a change in the acceleration if you were to plug the numbers into a spreadsheet and do math, but point is, the Starship is failing at this point, and it's probably failed. It's probably shut down its engines and is flying ballistically
Starship
over the
fail
Gulf
हो गया
of
लेकिन
Mexico.
बूस्टर आ गया
Now,
people
were
वही बोल रही थी बाबू भाई मैं भी जो ऊपर गया जो नीचे आया ना वही तो बोल रही थी मैं
Let's be clear, it hadn't been lost. It was still in space. It was still moving at Mach 20, and it was going to come down somewhere. I very quickly started to try to do
बहुत बढ़िया बाबू भाई बहुत शानदार.
Honestly, I failed terribly, because I get distracted by people starting to post videos from islands in the Caribbean and cruise ships which showed debris coming down. So yeah, this was extraordinarily spectacular. There are going to be videos all over the internet. I don't want to steal them all. People should get the clicks and views for this absolutely beautiful but somewhat terrifying event. When I do
ऐसा
my
लग रहा है
DJ
कोई
set
अच्छी
in
बात
Astro Words
हो नहीं
next,
सकती
you
यार
can bet that this
देखो
footage will be on the
कर
screen as
कर
Katy
छोटा
Perry
दिखेगी
is
उन्होंने
singing about fireworks.
जिसने भी
So this is
बिल्कुल
from the
असली में
Turks and
देखा होगा ना नजारा, अपन तो
Caicos
वीडियो
Islands.
देख
It's
रहे
at the
हैं,
far end. I think it's
क्या
one of the few pieces
खूबसूरत
of
नजारा
land the
बाबू भाई।
Starship
देखो
trajectory
आप
actually
ये
flies over.
देखो
And it's interesting because
बाप रे
the
बाप।
Starship launch happened at night, or as dusk was, as the sun was setting. This is basically one of those twilight astronomical events where the
परीक्षण
trail
फेल होते
is
होते भी इतना अच्छा
illuminated
नजारा
by the
दे गया
sun.
ये
And if
वाला।
you watch it as they pan back and forth,
ओ
you'll see that it
जैसे
is
सितारों की टोली
whiter
गिर रही हो,
towards where
देखो
the
तो
sun
सही।
वही तो
is, 'cause
गिरा
it's
मैं
getting
यार
fully illuminated, and then as they look
अद्भुत
towards the
चमत्कार है
east
चमत्कार
and the trail
अद्भुत
gets lower and the sun gets lower, it turns redder. That is one of the reasons why this trail represents such sublime beauty.
इंद्रधनुष
painted
जैसा नहीं लग
across
रहा
the
बाबू भाई
sky.
ये?
बिल्कुल देखिए
However, it also represents over
गोल होता है ये
100
सीधा
tons of
और
stainless
कुछ भी
steel
नहीं
and thermal
वो होता
protection
गोल
system
ये
descending
सीधा
through the Earth's atmosphere. And as it hits, it's gonna, the drag is gonna slow the parts down, and it's gonna rain down over a wide section of the Atlantic. And while people looking at this are no doubt admiring its beauty, they would
बिल्कुल
probably
बिल्कुल सही
prefer to
प्रशंसा कर रहे हैं
not
लोग
be
इसकी।
admiring it while they're sitting in a plane which is flying in circles north of the debris
अगर ये
zone,
लोगों के
just
ऊपर
in
गिर
case.
जाता नहीं तो
The ones
जितने
that
भी
like
जो
the provisional
चल
debris
पड़े
drop
ये
zone
सब
was
भूल
marked, but it
जाते
wasn't
जब
hot until the
और अगर
event
लोग
happened,
अंदर
at
होते
which
तो बाबू
point
भाई
और
a number of airliners would just like fly in holding patterns in circles, some diverted to different airports. But the problem is that it's a long, thin, wide section, and you can't really cross it without risking damage. And
जरूरी
look,
था ये तो।
I did some rough math that says that it's not such a big deal. They shouldn't be too worried, but aviation is a pretty risk-averse field, and so it's understandable that the aircraft decided to just like burn a bunch of fuel instead of risking flying through that. While we didn't know how long it would take for the debris to clear as it fell down from 100+ kilometers. And if we ever want humanity to get to the point where we're flying hundreds of people on spaceships like Starship, they're going to have to reach similar levels of risk aversion. Anyway, the next question I have is how they went from the loss of telemetry to the cloud of debris. And there are several videos showing a fairly spectacular explosion. But it wasn't initially clear
विस्फोट तो बहुत
when
खतरनाक
this
था बाबू भाई।
explosion occurred relative to when we lost telemetry. Was it the moment we lost telemetry, or was it some time later? So the answer to this came from Frank Taylor, who had been sent some images by
अरे
some
ये
friends that were
पूरा
in
के
the
पूरा जो
Bahamas,
मिशन है वो कोई छोटी
and
मोटी बात ही नहीं
they
बाबू
showed
भाई।
the time of the
अरे बाप रे।
explosion. He was able to look at the EXIF data on the images themselves, and that gave them a timestamp. And based on this timestamp, which was 17:48 and 23 seconds, that was about 11 and a half minutes after launch. And the telemetry was lost around 8 minutes and 30 seconds. So that's like 2.5 to 3 minutes between the telemetry loss and Starship becoming a ball of expanding gas in space. Now, from there, a number of pieces of debris emerge, and there's one obvious piece which initially is venting a lot of gas, and we can track that from the ground. And the great thing is that we can see when they stop venting gas and synchronize different videos that were taken at different times. And what's really interesting to this is that if you then run one of them forwards, you can actually see the time between that fading out, that venting, and the first pieces starting to heat up in the atmosphere is less than 30 seconds. So this object, when the thing exploded, it was already heading down. It was kind of deep inside the atmosphere. So in the 3 minutes between the engines, the telemetry being lost, there was no propulsion. It had begun falling down towards the Earth, and then something happened which caused it to explode. And then finally, of course, we actually have some details from SpaceX. Elon basically says that we had
ईंधन लीक
a
हो गया बाबू
fuel
भाई।
leak between the
ईंधन लीक हो
false
गया,
ceiling in
गैसेस
Starship,
निकल
basically
गई,
where the engines are,
उससे कारण हो
and
सकते हैं
the
इसमें।
actual bottom of the tank.
देखो
There was
कारण इसमें से
the fuel oxidizer leaking in there. They had a fire. Some of that would have been leaking out through the control surface hinge, and that's what we saw. Now, that would have led to the engine failure. And then my theory is that after that, the vehicle is more or less floating through space. It's shut down its engines. And as it begins to fall downwards, because it's not going fast enough to maintain orbit, it eventually leaves its desired corridor that it's supposed to remain within. And then the flight termination system activates, and we get the debris shower. So I don't believe this
चलो
fire
ये
led to an
सीखते हैं अपनी
explosion because there's too
पुरानी
long
अगर कोई सी
between that
गलती हो गई
initial
उससे
event
सीखते हैं अब
and
ये
the
इन्होंने
actual
पता लगाया देखा
explosion. I
सबसे
think
अच्छी
this is
बात
flight
हाँ।
कि
termination
क्या कारण
system
रहा
activating.
अब जब अगली बार करेंगे तो डबल मेहनत
Honestly,
करेंगे उस
I'm
कारण
kind
पे
of
कि
glad
ऐसा
of that
डबल ना हो
because it
ये
shrunk
पता भी लगाते
the
हैं
area that the debris was in. If it had exploded
ऑपरेशन का
in
जो
space right away, the
मकसद
debris would have been spread
यही
over
होता
a
है
wider
कि भाई
area.
पहले
It
फिर
could
इसको
have potentially
जांच लो
been a bit
परख
more
लो
trouble.
उसके बाद फिर
But honestly, I think they should really be questioning whether the flight termination system is something that should be activated under these circumstances. In this case, it was clearly heading out into the middle of the ocean. And I feel, and I don't have the numbers to back this up, I feel that it might have increased the danger by creating many more fragments as opposed to one big object which
सही
would
बात है
come down in a specific area. I think that, you know, the people involved, the safety people at the FAA
पर
and
ऐसा भी
SpaceX
मुमकिन है कि एक
should
जगह
really
पे
look
गिरे तो
into
ज्यादा बड़ा
are
विस्फोट हो
there
जाए
regimes in which
टुकड़े गिर रहे हैं खैर
flight
दोनों ही चीजें जो हैं अच्छी नहीं है
basically
मगर आप
transition
ठीक है
into
क्या कर सकते हैं
Starship trying to land glide to safety somewhere rather than destroying itself into many small pieces that could hit aircraft. I will be very surprised if the FAA doesn't demand some sort of investigation here. They are actually investigating Blue Origin, by the way. Their failed booster recovery qualifies as a mishap. In this case, yes, all the debris landed probably within their zones that were designated, but on the other hand, that is little comfort to all the aircraft that had to fly in circles or divert to other airports.
बाबू भाई ये भी क्या
Starship is
सोच
like
के
a
रखते
whole
होंगे कि
other
अगर
level
बाय
in terms of
बाय
space
चांस ऐसा
hardware, right? It is
विस्फोट
so
हो गया
much bigger
तो इसके
than
टुकड़े
anything
कहाँ
else,
गिरेंगे
and it is tougher. It's not made of
समुद्र में
aluminium, it's
बिजली
made of
गिरी
stainless
अच्छा
steel.
मतलब
And the
जरूरी
debris
थोड़ी है
that
ये
it
जो सब
produces
सोचते
is
हैं वैसे ही
more
होता है क्या
likely
हमेशा
to
मतलब एक
descend
प्रश्न था
through
मेरे
the
मन में आया
atmosphere and potentially cause trouble on the ground. And look, we live in a
पहले
world
काम
where
होता
we
है
have
पहले इनका प्लान
passenger
बनता है कि
airliners, which
अगर
are
अच्छा
कुछ
hundreds
ऐसा
of
होता है तो
tons
अपने कुछ ये
flying
कर
over
जो
dense
कंट्रोल जो
city
होता है
centers.
कंट्रोल
And we
इसको
accept it because we've
बिगड़
made
सही
aircraft
बोल रहे हो आप
very, very
और
safe.
एक जगह वो
And
चीज
if we
हो
ever
जाए
want to
तो
live in that sci-fi
गड्ढे हो जाए
future
वो
where
खतरनाक
everybody
बड़ा
gets to go to space on
तो वो
vacation,
सब
we
ये
have to
प्लानिंग
reach
से होते हैं
that level of safety and reliability with
सही
spacecraft.
बात है
And
सुरक्षा तो बहुत
humanity's
ज्यादा
going to do
जरूरी
this
है
बहुत
through good
जरूरी है
engineering because that's how many problems get solved.
बिल्कुल
Look,
बिल्कुल
I'm sort of
सही
sad
बात
that this
ये है।
flight definitely felt like a step back, definitely from a step back from number 5. Obviously, they're going to have to take a good hard look at the designs on
वो
V2
वापस
Starship.
मुकाम पे
Hopefully,
और कितनी
they'll
तेजी
come
से
up with enough
वापस
solutions. They'll be able to move
वो
forward.
बहुत शानदार
जल्दी
मैच
है
है
जाके
Very
अपने
glad
मुकाम
that
पे
we
आएंगे
got a
या ये
fantastic looking booster
बिल्कुल
catch. That
बिल्कुल
was once again super exciting to watch.
बिल्कुल
And
सही
I
है
will remind you that in that booster there is
ये
a
ये
reused
नकली
engine,
लग रही है बाबू भाई
engine
जिसमें
number
कि असली है ये
314, one of the booster engines and
बाकी
are
वो
in the outer ring.
बाकी बिल्कुल
It
असली
had
देखो
previously
क्या
flown
बात
on
है
Flight
बिल्कुल सही
5
जगह पे आया
and now it has flown
क्या
on
बात
Flight
है
7 and been recovered for a second time. So
हमारे
yes,
लिए गर्व
Pi
की
is
बात है
truly one
ऐसे
of the
लम्हे
most
के लिए हम
important
साक्षी बन रहे हैं
numbers. I'm
बहुत
Scott
गर्व की बात
Manley.
है
Fly safe.
बाकी में साहब ये जो पैशन जो दिखाया गया है वो बाकी में तारीफ है काबिल और बिल्कुल सोचने लगा है कि इतना दिमाग इन लोगों में कैसे आया कि किसी भी चीज को उन्होंने ऊपर भेजा और वापस आके उसको अपने कंट्रोल पे ले गए ना और उसको वो वापस उसी जगह ले गए ना हर किसी को बुझे काम नहीं बहुत ही होशियार और जानकर अपने का ये काम हो सकता है
मुझे तो सबसे ज्यादा खुशी इस बात की हुई कि ऐसे अद्भुत मंजर को हम देखने के लिए साक्षी बने मतलब हर किसी के नसीब में नहीं होता और जब हम बहुत बुढ़े हो जाएंगे बाबू भाई तो मैं कभी बैठ के अपने जो पोता पोती उनसे जिक्र करूंगी कि भैया वो मैंने स्टारशिप को देखा था उसके बूस्टर को देखा था ये हमारे लिए बड़ी गर्व की बात है और दूसरी बात जब परीक्षण किया जाता है तो छोटी छोटी चीजों को बहुत अच्छे से ध्यान रखा जाता है जैसे कि अगर परीक्षण सफल रहा तो हमें और कितने बेहतर बनाना है और अगर विफल भी रहा तो क्या कमियां थी उसमें हमें बिल्कुल सुधार करना है तो मुझे देख के तो बहुत ज्यादा मजा आया और बिल्कुल एक बोलते ना परियों की कहानी बिल्कुल मेरे लिए ऐसा ही था ये देखना
अब आपके लिए तो परियों की कहानी जैसे लगा कि जो लोग इसमें इतने दिन उन्होंने लगाए इतनी मेहनत करी इतनी कोशिश करी इतना दिमाग लगाया उसका वो चीज को छोड़ा तो कोशिश तो उन्होंने अपनी जगह पूरी करी लेकिन अब इंसान ये गलती तो हो जाती है लेकिन यह अच्छा है कि जैसे उन्होंने करा तो उसी उसके जो कंट्रोल को करा वो कंट्रोल बाकी में चल पे काम है।
और जैसे कि शुरू में ही एक चीज बहुत मुझे अजीब सी लगी थी कि अगर वाकई में अगर इस शिप के अंदर लोग बैठे हुए होते हैं तो वो जो शिप जरा जिस तरह से टूटी और आसमान में तारे बिखरने जैसा मंजर था, तो मुझे वो थोड़ा सा सोच के मतलब ऊपर वाले से प्रार्थना करती हूँ कि हर परीक्षण सफल रहे, पर ऐसा हकीकत में हो तो कैसा होगा। तो उसके लिए वाकई में बहुत ज्यादा मजबूत कदम उठाते हैं वैज्ञानिक कि ऐसा कोई गलती ना हो उनसे। हमें तो देख के बहुत मजा आया और फिर से मिलेंगे किसी मजेदार वीडियो के साथ। तब तक के लिए
धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत आभार।